Okay, Treshani Perera, and the presentation is called Project Management from the Middle, Practical Strategies for Managing Inherited Projects. Treshani Perera is the Music and Fine Arts Cataloging Librarian at the University of Kentucky and is responsible for original and complex copy cataloging of all formats and subject areas in the Fine Arts Library. Treshani also serves as the head of the Fine Arts Cataloging Unit, which she oversees, cataloging, processing, and preservation operations, manages a team of 3 employees, and manages special projects in the Fine Arts Library. Treshani is an active member of the Music Library Association and MOUG. Okay, now we're gonna try to do this. Bear with me, I'm gonna try to share this video. I found it. Okay. And then once the video is done, we will take questions and answers using the same method, assuming Treshani is feeling well enough to do it. Can you all see the VLC screen? I hope. All right, we're just gonna go for it. Oh, wait, I didn't share my sound. Hold on. Let's try that again. Okay. I think that's working. Let's do this. Play.
Good afternoon. I had hoped to be doing this presentation live, but unfortunately I'm feeling under the weather, so sharing this video instead. I hope I can join you in the chat during the presentation time. I'm Treshani Perera, my pronouns are she, her. Hopefully you heard my bio, so I won't repeat anything else. This is Project Management from the Middle, Practical Strategies for Managing Inherited Projects. I will say that I'm a minimalist when it comes to slides. So if you'd like to see more text to follow along with what I'm saying, hopefully the closed caption button will be helpful to see some text to go along with the minimalist screen. A raw transcript will appear in a separate panel. So why this presentation? Why is it important to talk about project management for inherited projects? Managing inherited projects can take a different approach compared to those you initiate and plan from the beginning of the project. Catalogers may initiate projects in alignment with professional interests as well as institutional priorities, but may also inherit projects as a result of staff turnover, retirements, reorganizations, and in my case, when you accept a new job. Managing in-progress projects, projects that were envisioned, pre-planned, and planned by others, call for different skills and steps compared to managing projects you initiate. What I hope to share with you today is what has worked for me to manage 2 projects I inherited more than 4 years ago, how I've managed time, resources, and people to complete these projects with ownership. And now an obligatory caveat. This is not a project management workshop, and I'm not a certified project manager. In fact, there are folks in this community that are much more qualified and skilled to talk about project management standards and principles. My presentation will touch on stages in project management, but this is not a project management 101 type session. I will refer to principles used in project management, but the purpose of this presentation is to give you tips and practical strategies for managing inherited projects. If you'd like to learn about project management, I recommend the Project Management Institute website. I've included the website in my resources list, which you will see at the end. Project management best practices recommend specific steps to consider during the 4 stages of project management. First stage is starting, initiating, or pre-planning the project. Second stage is planning the project, which is the stage where you create a project plan and form a project team. Third stage is implementing or executing the project according to the project plan. The last stage is assessment and completing the project. When you look at literature on project management, most assume that one person is starting, planning, executing, and closing the project. In other words, there's one project manager from the beginning to the end. In general, best practices and recommendations focus on what you should do during each of the 4 stages. What I have found in my experience is that these best practices don't always apply directly to inherited projects. For example, project management best practices recommend a project plan during the planning stage. What if you inherited a project without a project plan, outlining who is doing the work, who are the stakeholders who need to know about project updates, budget for the project, timeline, goals, communication plan, and so on. If these specifics aren't readily available to you as the new project manager, you may need to retroactively create a project plan to use going forward. What if you inherited a project with no proper documentation on workflows, which should have been documented during the pre-planning and planning stages? This type of situation would require you to pause and retroactively create workflow documents based on existing project documents. Workflow documents are extremely helpful when training and managing people as part of projects. What this also means is that contrary to an employee's expectation, you will not be able to hit the ground running on day 1. If you're managing a project that was envisioned, planned, and started by someone else, it may take weeks or months before you're ready to continue an in-progress project. So over the next few minutes, I hope to go through some practical steps and strategies that I have taken for managing 2 large-scale projects that I inherited when I accepted my current position over 4 years ago. The projects are now nearly completed, which is a good time to do this reflection. I'll briefly describe the projects I oversee before discussing specifics to consider for managing inherited projects. I also made some changes to project directions as the new project manager, and I'll talk more about that later. So as I mentioned earlier, I inherited 2 large-scale projects when I started my position. As a project manager, I managed the arrangement and description aspects of these projects. So a little bit about each project. The Lair Sheet Music Collection, which is a donation from John C. Lair, is a large sheet music collection covering popular music and songs from the late 1800s through the first half of the 20th century. Collection processing and metadata work is complete. The collection consists of nearly 10,000 pieces of vocal and instrumental sheet music. The project team was made up of 1 staff member with no formal music background or metadata experience, 1 student assistant with formal music background but no metadata work experience, and myself as a project manager. Staff and student work is done, and most of the work to be done is at my level, which is reviewing subject headings supplied by staff and overall metadata review before making the collection metadata spreadsheet public. The School of Music Recordings collection is much more complex in nature as it's an ongoing project. We have finished processing and metadata entry for all transfers to date, the last date being February 2020. Up until the end of last month, the project had dedicated student support with a dedicated project team consisting of 1 student assistant with formal music background and myself as a project manager. Going forward, project work will be done seasonally with support from circulation students and myself continuing as the project manager. So here are some practical strategies and steps I've taken for managing inherited projects. I'll share examples from projects along the way. Talk to your colleagues. This is a no-brainer, but may not be the first step most people take for managing inherited projects. If the previous project manager is not available, meaning they have left the organization or they retired long before you came on board, talk to your colleagues, your supervisor, project team members if they are continuing with the project. It is important to have these conversations before you start working on the project. During these conversations, you will learn about how or why the project was created, what was the project hoping to accomplish, who else worked on the project, who else you should talk to get more information about the project. So this step, as a first step, can be very helpful. Stakeholders is a common word in project management literature. Stakeholders don't always need to have personal investment in the project. As an example, as a project manager for the School of Music Recordings collection, I had conversations with several Fine Arts Library Public Services colleagues to learn about what they would like to see as an outcome of the project, especially since they will likely respond to patron requests for collection items. But I also emphasized my role with the project, that I'm only responsible for collection arrangement and description, so that we have realistic expectations. You definitely want to talk to your supervisor to know what their goals are for the project. I included the previous project manager in parentheses here because that may not work in every situation. While you may want to reach out to them hoping for a favorable response, that may not go according to plan. Documentation. I simply cannot overemphasize the importance of documentation when you're a project manager. It's easy to procrastinate and say, I'll do this later, but this is a good habit to cultivate at the beginning of a project, whether you're starting one or executing a project initiated by someone else. If you've inherited a project with no documentation, this is a necessary step before you start doing any work. If you've expected to train others to do project work, this step is essential. Document your workflows, how metadata entry is done, how processing is done. Don't rely on your own memory, as you may find yourself having to train a new student during the course of the project, especially if it's ongoing in nature. Documentation is necessary for consistent work and standardizing processes. So for the sheet music collection project, I was very fortunate to have good documentation from my predecessor, Carrie Bonack. She had created a metadata application profile for the collection, which I continued with when I took over as the project manager. So let's start project plan. If you've never seen one or created a project plan, you can start by Googling project management plan or project charter. You may have heard of Gantt charts, G-A-N-T-T, Gantt charts, which is a type of project plan in a timeline format. Like I mentioned before, a project plan is created during the planning stage when you document project goals, outcomes, deliverables, scope of the project, budget, communication plan, project team and their responsibilities, and a timeline for completing the project. These are the essentials, and depending on the nature of the project, especially if it's grant funded, there may be additional details to note. A project plan is intended to guide project work. If you've inherited a project with no project plan, my personal recommendation is to take the time to create one before you start work. Functions like a checklist to guide project activities, and it's one of those things that will help later with assessment and report writing at the end of the project. Project team. The two projects I inherited had unique project teams in place. When I took over the Layer Sheet Music Collection project, there was one staff member assigned to the project, but that person announced retirement within several months, and I needed to hire new personnel. I was also hiring a project student assistant at the same time. This was a good time to rethink which skills need to be included in project team members and prioritize hiring a student assistant with music background. This also proved to be a good decision as the staff member hired did not have formal music background. In the end, the new project team for the sheet music collection had one full-time staff member with 30% of their time dedicated to the project and one part-time graduate music student, which led to collection processing and metadata entry being completed in about 3 years. If you find yourself in a position where you're being asked to manage a project with no staff or student support, I recommend you advocating for a project team. Your institution may not have the budget to hire a full-time staff member, but there may be other ways to request dedicated staff time or a student position to help with project management. Goals, deliverables, and timelines. This next one is tied to the project plan, which I talked about earlier. If you decide to implement or execute a project without an official project plan, I encourage you to at least come up with project goals and deliverables, as well as a possible timeline before you start working on the project. These will help you and the rest of the project team to stay on track and meet project milestones along the way. This is especially important for ongoing projects and large-scale projects with unknown quantities. Goals and deliverables are easy to determine during the early stages of projects. but timelines may be difficult to predict for large-scale projects and ongoing projects. So for the sheet music collection, my goal was to process the sheet music collection, create metadata in a spreadsheet format using modified Dublin Core, and have a deliverable of a searchable spreadsheet available for public access. As far as the timeline, I had hoped to finish the project in December 2020, but the timeline inevitably got extended due to the pandemic. Despite COVID delays and interruptions due to remote work, staff and student work were completed in April 2021. For the School of Music Recordings collection, I estimated similar goals for processing collection items and metadata entry with a deliverable of a searchable collection inventory spreadsheet. The timeline established was only for processing the backlog of unprocessed items. Since it's an ongoing collection, the timeline will be ongoing as well. Oops. And finally, be willing to clearly communicate changes to project directions. If you end up changing the scope of the project or outcomes of the project as the new project manager, I'll share some changes I made to both projects as the new project manager. I did not make any scope changes or project direction changes to the sheet music collection, other than responsibilities at project team member level. Under the previous project manager, processing and transcription were done at staff level, with work designated as low priority. And the project manager was responsible for reviewing staff work and adding subjects. So it was only a two-person project team. When I took over as the project manager, I changed responsibilities at various levels. For example, the student was responsible for processing the collection in folders and transcribing metadata from items. New staff was hired with 30% of their time for project work. They were responsible for reviewing student work and adding subjects. I created a list of terms appropriate for subject analysis of vocal music in a popular music sheet music collection. And I will review staff work and overall collection metadata decisions. Delegated responsibilities have allowed me to focus on higher level decisions and the rest of the project team to engage in collection processing and description. When I took over as the project manager for the School of Music Recordings collection, I made several changes. I felt empowered to do so because the project was still in an exploratory stage under my predecessor. Even though the project manager role was inherited, I approached the project almost as if it's a new project because there was a lot of flexibility to change directions. The main change I made was to abandon item level catalog records and go with a modified Dublin Core schema for metadata entry in a spreadsheet format. As a deliverable, I prioritized a comprehensive collection inventory to assist public services folks with reference requests. My responsibilities as project manager are limited to physical collection processing and metadata entry, which also meant that I could keep the scope of the project fairly narrow. I kept my colleagues informed about changes and also planned project meetings to discuss changes and get their input. As long as you're clearly communicating changes to others, people will not oppose your professional judgment as the project manager. So hopefully you are able to learn something new during this session and think about steps to consider for inherited projects. I hope this was also helpful to folks currently managing projects and are thinking about how to transfer those to others as part of retirements and other staff separations. So here are some resources I've been consulted for managing my own projects. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Treshani. Let me stop sharing the screen. And it looks like she's here, so we're gonna bring her up on screen for some questions and discussion. There we go. Hi, Treshani, are you there?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm sorry I couldn't do the presentation live today, but I'm glad to be here and take some questions.
All right. So we have a question from Mark. Would be interesting to compare inheriting projects when you are hired principally for other reasons as opposed to being hired for projects itself. Do you think there would be more leeway for tweaking in one situation or the other?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, I will say these projects are not the primary focus of my position. Obviously, I was hired to be the original cataloger. And so starting, I mean, I think it was during the interviewing stages, it was made aware that there are some projects that I will be responsible for, but I think it was always under the assumption sort of like my cataloging work will always take precedence. But that's an interesting, definitely something that I hadn't thought about, Mark, but I will certainly be thinking about that. That's an interesting question. Thank you. I don't know if I have a great answer at this point, but I would assume it would be different, especially if somebody is hired as a project manager for a grant funded position, certainly, right? Like that's going to be a focus. Yeah, I think there might be some flexibility if it's, you know, like a portion of their time dedicated for managing projects. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
All right. And Mark says, I wonder if Anna Lopret might have a thought on this. Yeah, she probably does. Okay, yeah. And Michelle in the chat says it would technically depend on the project charter, not the same as the project plan, and more likely to be more flexible as a hired project manager, because that's supposed to be part of the PM's job.
I will definitely refer to Michelle's response as a project manager.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I mean, I can totally relate to this, to your presentation and to your situation, you know, coming in and it's not due to any sort of, you know, lack of planning or lack of work of your predecessors. It's just that projects are big and they take a lot of time and things happen, and people change and you inherit these things. Okay, here we go. Ronnie has a question. Any suggestions for implementing students and interns in project team for specialized projects? It's hard to get other staff to dedicate the time. My issue is that interns are only there for a short period of time and students tend to be unreliable. It's almost not worth the time to take to train them. Others can chime in on this.
That's a great question, Ronnie. So this is going to be interesting because going forward, while I will be the project manager for the School of Music recordings, I will be relying on circulation students, which, you know, so there is that longevity situation to consider. Yeah, that's a really, I will say I lucked out with the project student position. The first project student position, she had committed to 12 to 15 hours a week. She stayed for 3 years. So that was, and she was also a graduate student. And so she's, you know, there was a long period where sort of the training and the time investment, you know, was worth it because she stayed with the project. And she actually started and finished. She was on the project team from the beginning to the end for the sheet music collection. So that meant I had to train that student only once. The other collection, we have had some changes because obviously when they graduated, I had to hire another student. I think for me, really, this might seem like a cop-out, but what has really helped me with training is documentation. I have good documentation. I use screenshots so that I don't have to be around for sort of like the basic workflow questions. And, you know, I try to prioritize a good onboarding experience at the beginning, but I tend to push students towards documentation as much as I can. Because then that way, you know, most of the questions are sort of like a workflow thing. It's like, oh, what do I do after this? So maybe, you know, if you're in a situation where you are having to rely on interns and students, try documentation, try workflows with like screenshots. That might save you some sort of ongoing training needs. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? So
Sure.
Do you have any tips for making the documentation process easier and more fun?
It's fun. I mean, I like documentation, so I think I might be one of those weird people. But I think also it sort of a little tip that has worked for me is I usually write the documentation and go through the workflow myself, and then sort of I'm doing it first on my own before I train somebody else, so that I work out all the clinks, I work out all the sort of unclear wording things, the screenshots. And then I usually give, like if it's a new student, for example, I'll give them a chance to go through it on their own and write down the questions before we do an in-person training. Because then sometimes I've had to review and revise my documentation because a student will inevitably ask, what does that mean? And I was like, oh, that's jargon. I need to like be more clear. It's easy to say, oh, I'll do this later. And I mean, you know, I'm not perfect with that. I've put off documentation myself. But I think if you can sort of discipline yourself to do it, like while you're planning, while you're getting ready for training somebody, I think that's the easiest time to do it.
Well, thanks. We have a question from Norhawk. I think continuing your predecessor's projects is very important. I'd expect the same. For example, I wrote a $50,000 grant here for a production lab to attract artists to the library, and I would expect the next person after me to take on the project and continue it. What is your approach completely ending or changing the project? Do you get votes from your team?
So I think I understand your question, and please correct me if this is a wrong interpretation, Norhak. So in my case, I also found myself in a very unique situation because I got to pick my project teams, even though the projects were inherited. And I understand that that's not always going to be the case. And I think it may be challenging if you're the only new person and everybody else is continuing. I would certainly, and like I think that's what I mentioned in the slides, you definitely want to talk to those people to see what their experience has been. So I did when I started the sheet music collection, I overlapped with the staff member for 8 months. And so we had meetings because they were the one who, you know, they were doing the processing. And so we had talked about it. We had, you know, at that point, we didn't really have a project team. Because in the way how retirements go, you do have to announce retirements, you know, like a certain period in advance. And so I think we had check-ins, but I wouldn't necessarily say there was like a sort of a focused project team at that point. But I learned a lot of things just from how, you know, they were processing materials, which was really helpful when I was doing the documentation for the student. And so I definitely continued the way we were doing processing. So like for sheet music, we had been processing in individual folders, numbering the folders, the box folder information was on the folder. So we were approaching, you know, it as an archival collection. And so, yes, I definitely sort of like watched them do the work and talk to them about their process to understand sort of like what they were doing. But I will also say sort of like what was unique to me was that sort of, you know, 9 months into sort of my role as a project management, I actually got to pick my own team. So that meant I could make some, you know, I was able to make some changes. And they were mostly sort of like, you know, sort of responsibility changes. They were not really sort of changing how the processing was done, how, you know, the work was done. Because that all sort of stayed on for the sheet music collection. It was simply sort of like reassigning some of those responsibilities. And also because, you know, we had a graduate music student who had the subject expertise and who had the knowledge of sheet music to do a little bit more than just typing, you know, the title and the names and publishers into a spreadsheet. So yeah, it was a little bit different, but I would definitely, you know, I agree. I think it's important to preserve as much as you can, especially if it doesn't make sense to change those things, sort of like the routine operational things. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Treshani. I think we are out of time for this session. We had a couple of good comments in the chat and the Q&A about asking students to actually write the documentation with you while they're working on it. I think that's a great idea. I haven't thought about that. So I think we're going to have to end this, but thank you for joining us, Treshani.
Thank
I
you
hope
so
you feel
much.
better.
Thank you. Thank you all.